Great. So I hope you were able to do the same thing we did here with JSON object request, but in this case for you, I want you to do that with JSON array request. Very good. We'll go ahead and do that in a second here. But before we go further, you notice that we're able to get our JSON response and it looks great. However, that's not very helpful because we want to probe in and get all these fields values. So let's say if we want to get the title, how do we do that? Well, because it is indeed an object, right? Like I said before, JSON object nonetheless, we can probe in and get information that we want. To do that, simply, we have to say JSON response, because that is our object, the whole thing, as you see here, and say dot title, and we should get the actual title. Okay, so at this point here, I can just come down there, say dot get string, and pass the title like that. Okay, now it's going to complain a little bit here because it says, well, because we understand that there are times whenever we're dealing with JSON object, which means we're getting stuff from the internet. And even though we have taken all the precautions that we can, right, using volley here, there are times when things won't work as expected. And so whenever we are trying to get something from a JSON object, it always gives us this kind of an exception warning that say, hey, this could go wrong. So we need to put things in place here. That way, if something goes wrong, there's ways in which we can fail gracefully. That's what's happening here. So if you double click there and come down here, you can say we can surround this with try and catch. So click that, and all of a sudden we have this entity try and catch. What is this? So this simply says, okay, we're going to go ahead and give a try to see if this actually works, because we're dealing with JSON, like I said, and things could go wrong because we are fetching things over the internet, right? So we're going to try that. If something goes wrong, then we're going to catch that exception. An exception in this case in programming is just an error. Okay, something did not go wrong. So there is indeed a JSON exception that we can actually pass inside of our catch. So let's catch that error before we even move forward or before we just crash completely, like the application would in this case just crash. And we don't want that, okay? So anytime we have these issues, we are recommended to put inside of a try catch. Okay, so try this. If something doesn't go right, something goes wrong, we're going to catch that exception, that error, and we can do all sort of things to tell the user who is using this application what happens. But it's all going to be gracefully and not all of a sudden the application is no longer working. That's all, right? Save that. And what we're going to do, let's go ahead and give it another run. Let's open our run there. And look at that, on response, delectus out item. So what it did, it went ahead and got this first item here. So you notice there's 3 here because it's been running for a while anyway. So it's going ahead and got this delectus out item. So that is working, folks. That means we're able to probe in and start getting the actual information that we need from our API. In this case here, just getting this first one, a title. And remember, I'm just getting 1 at this point here because, let's go back down here, because this point here, my point where I'm pointing the API to get me something, is just to go and get me 1 item only. So this is what we're getting. In your case, if you did the exercise, the little challenge I asked you, you should also have, like I said, the JSON array request, which we're going to do right now. So I'm going to come down here after this request. In fact, before that, in this case, I'm going to say the JSON array request. So that is another kind of request that you can see that we can do when it comes to volley. So we can do even string request as well. Okay, you can play around with that. And let's go to the actual next and next, just to get back to where we were. So we have JSON array, JSON object, and you saw string requests there, which you can look at it in your own time. But the main important ones are these 2. So we looked at JSON object request. Now we're going to look at JSON array request. Okay, it says request for retrieving a JSON array response body at any given URL. So the process is going to be the same. Let's go ahead and do that. I know you probably already did this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So what I'm going to do, again, JSON array request. There we go. Call this JSON array request, new JSON array request, like that. The first thing happens here, we have to pass the request dot method we want to get, like that. And then we're going to pass the URL. We already have the URL. However, like I said before, the URL has to change a little bit here instead of just this one here, because that will just bring us to this object. We want, let's go to do this again, this whole one. So I'm going to copy all of that, come down here, because it's an URL, it's a string, like that. So next one, I'm going to just pass null, and then I'm going to pass the new response listener, hit enter, and voila, we have our response listener. Now you notice the difference here, we have JSON array. Going to do the same thing we did before, because we have to pass our error listener here, new response, error response listener, like that. And of course, make sure we finish with semicolon there, and there we go. Okay, very good. So now we've created our JSON array request. For JSON request here, we pass null, make sure we have that, and everything is looking good. That means then inside of our own response here, like we did before, it looks exactly the same pretty much as our JSON object, but the difference here is that we have JSON types, JSON object here inside of our listener, angular brackets. That means we're expecting these JSON types. Makes sense because this is JSON object. And we also response here, JSON object type. That is the root that we're getting. But here for array, it's JSON array. So that is a distinction. Okay, it makes sense because, like I said again, this is a JSON array request. Therefore, we have to expect a JSON array response. In fact, come down here, and I'm going to go ahead and say log d, and I'm going to say response such, give it JSON array like that. And don't forget, I'm going to just close this one here, and I'm going to say request. This is very important. Always add your request. So in this case, it's going to be JSON array. There we go. Save. Notice that now I killed this other one here. We could have left that way because the request queue would know exactly what to do for each case, right? So I'm going to save this and see what's going to happen. Everything is good. Let's run. Go to our logcat. And voila, you can see response, JSON array response here. We have these entire array. You can see it's big because we can keep going that we got because it's all an array. But the beauty here is that we understand now we were able to get the whole array because, again, you see we have our square brackets there and then we have objects inside. So it's essentially exactly the same what we have here, right? So we got this whole array object here, okay, which contains all these little objects inside. Very good. Now you may ask, okay, how do I then probe in through and get information? Let's say I want to get all of the user IDs or all of the titles that are inside of our payload here. How do we do that? Well, because we know it's an array, really. And so being an array, inside of each index, we have an object. We can do that. We've done this a few times. Okay, let's see how we can actually get that done. Well, coming inside here of our own response, what we can do, first of all, we have to do some parsing. So for that, I'm going to say for int I, 0, I is less than response dot what? Length, right? I plus plus. Again, I'm able to do this because I know response, again, is just an array, JSON array. So that's why I can get the length, okay? Like that. But notice it's JSON array, so that's why we have the actual length method there, okay? Very good. So in this case here, I can just loop through and get all the object. But here's the thing. We said that inside of this array, we have a little object. So that means each index is an object, right? Now we can't just say, in this case, response.userid. It's not going to work because response is going to be the whole array. To probe in, we have to actually go ahead and create a JSON object so that then we can get inside of that JSON object and get information. So this is when we have to create another JSON object here. So if you go ahead and say JSON object, there we go. I'm going to call this JSON object. I'm going to say is equal to what? I'm going to set our response dot get JSON object, and we're going to pass I. There we go. So we're going to have a little problem here, probably because we need to put all of stuff inside of a try and catch here for reasons that I said before. But let's think about this. So because here we are saying inside of our array, JSON array, we have objects. So we have to then convert in code, get these objects before we actually able to get inside of each object's fields here. That's what we're doing here. So we're saying as we loop through, we're going to create a JSON object because that's what we are after, really. And to get that, we say response.getJSON object and pass indeed the iterator. Now, each time we go through, it's going to go ahead and fetch each of these objects and put in a JSON object. And you notice how handy this is because we are using JSON object. It has all of the methods that we need in order to do all of that. Look at this, response.getJSON object, and we pass in the index. So this getJSON object knows exactly how to extract from this response because it knows it's not just a normal JSON object. It's an array which contains object. So it knows that we must want to get the actual JSON object inside of this array. So we pass here our iterator. So each time it goes, we're creating a new JSON object. Now that we have this JSON object, we can then go ahead and do what we want to do. In this case, we can go ahead and say we want to get all of the titles of all objects that are inside of our JSON array. And how do we do that? Well, I'm going to come down here or up here. I'm going to cut all of that and put it all here. Okay. And now I'm going to just call the JSON object and do the same thing I did before, get string, right? We have to pass the actual name of our field. In this case, let's say we want title. Remember, these fields have to be exactly the same that we added because these are the IDs. I cannot say titles because it's going to come out here and look through and we'll never find the titles, hence give us an error, which is not good. So these are very important. These IDs have to be indeed here the same as they are here. So that's why we have get string. Now we're able to go through and get the string title. And I know it's a string because it says here, we have the double quotes. What do you think would happen if I wanted to get this completed? It would not be get string, would it? It would be get boolean. And guess what? We do have that as well. So if I come down here, I can say JSON object dot get, look at this, boolean, and can pass the string because the name is always going to be a string. It's looked at as a string. So in this case here, what do we want to get? Completed as such. So in this case, I can put inside of a boolean I or boolean D, something like this. Okay, that works. And we can use that D to do whatever we want to do. All right, so let's go save this and see what's going to happen. Go ahead and run. Open our logcat and look at that. Look, all of these responses are showing now. These are the titles. All of these are coming from our object, our JSON array. All right, look at that. All of this. Very good. And of course, we can concatenate things here because this is just a string at this point, right? If I want to actually put before anything, let's say I want to say plus JSON object, right, dot get boolean, or let's say get string, because we just want to get. Let's see what is it that we can get at this point. Let's go and get the ID. Okay. I'm going to say get string ID. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay. And let's put a little space there. Let's see how this is going to work. Put a plus. There we go. Okay. So you can also see there and look at it's working. So in this case here, just shows everything, even previous ones. That's the beauty of logcat. So there we go. Now we know how to get objects, JSON objects from a JSON array. So it's very important to understand this concept because that will allow you to look at any API. And first of all, have to look at the kind of the root that we have. The root in this case I'm talking about here is this. Is this an array list or will it be something like this as the root, right? So if it is the root indeed like this, that means we are talking about, in this case, it is a JSON object, okay, not JSON array request. With that information, then you know whether to use a JSON array request or a JSON object request. And now you also know how to get information inside of JSON array, which in this case is an object. And you will know, in fact, what I want you to do is to do a little quick search online, find free APIs, okay, of any kind. You can find free APIs for the news or free APIs for jokes or whatever it is that you can find. And see if you can loop through and get information from those APIs using what you know right now, using Volley and all the classes there. Right? But make sure to pay attention to the root. That is very important because if you have, in this case here, a JSON array and you instantiate a JSON object, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have a problem because it's going to come down here and say, well, this is not an object, it's an array, so I'm going to just fail. Okay, so this is very important. So distinguish between whether to use a JSON array request or a JSON object request. That is the goal here. And of course, being able to loop through and get the information that you want.